Sergeant Marcus Hayes had been stationed on Zirian Station for 6 months, long enough to learn that diplomatic crises could manifest in ways that no military training adequately prepared you for. The current crisis wasn't about territorial disputes or trade agreements, it was about a baby who had been crying for 14 straight hours and showed no signs of stopping. The royal nursery adjoining the diplomatic chambers echoed with the desperate wails of the newest member of the Zephyrian royal family, born 3 days earlier to Queen Lireleth during what were supposed to be historic peace negotiations. Instead of celebration, the infant's continuous distress had transformed the already tense diplomatic proceedings into something approaching chaos. The heir apparent's behavior continues to disrupt essential governmental functions, observed Ambassador Kane of the Crystalline Coalition with barely concealed irritation. Perhaps this indicates the Zephyrian leadership's diminished capacity for managing even basic responsibilities. Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the diplomatic slight disguised as concern. He'd been observing the situation from his position as security medical officer, and what he saw was a stressed new mother and an infant in obvious distress, not political incompetence worthy of international criticism. Queen Lireleth appeared at the nursery entrance, her luminescent skin pale with exhaustion and her pointed ears drooping with fatigue that went far beyond normal postpartum recovery. In the 3 days since giving birth, she had barely slept, spending every moment trying to comfort a child who seemed inconsolable despite the attention of the finest Zephyrian physicians. "Your Majesty," said Dr. Veltaran, the chief royal physician, approaching with obvious frustration, "we have attempted every traditional remedy. The infant shows no signs of illness, yet the distress continues without explanation." "There must be something," Queen Lireleth said, her voice carrying desperation that transcended species boundaries. "Children don't cry without reason. There has to be something we're missing." Marcus had been thinking the same thing. His medical training included pediatric care from his time serving in human conflict zones, where stress-related infant disorders were unfortunately common. The royal baby's crying patterns weren't random, they showed specific rhythms and intensities that suggested particular types of distress. Perhaps, Ambassador Kane continued with diplomatic poison, this unfortunate situation indicates that the Zephyrian Empire lacks the stability necessary for successful peace agreements. After all, if basic child care proves beyond their capabilities. Queen Lireleth's expression darkened with anger that made the air around her seem to shimmer with barely controlled energy. "Ambassador Kane, my personal situation has no bearing on my people's commitment to these negotiations. Personal situations have political implications when they disrupt essential diplomatic functions," Kane replied smoothly. "The constant noise makes productive discussion impossible." Marcus watched Queen Lireleth struggle with exhaustion, stress, and the impossible position of being judged as both mother and ruler based on circumstances beyond her control. The infant's cries echoed through the diplomatic chambers, growing more desperate with each passing hour. From his position near the security station, Marcus could observe details that the Zephyrian medical team seemed to be missing. The baby's breathing patterns, the way her tiny fists clenched during particularly intense crying episodes, the specific pitch and rhythm of her distress, all suggested sensory overload rather than physical illness. Human infants in war zones often developed similar symptoms when exposed to high-stress environments. The constant tension, the emotional chaos of adults under pressure, the inability to escape from overwhelming stimuli, all could create a feedback loop where an infant became increasingly distressed because everyone around them was increasingly stressed by the infant's distress. But suggesting that alien royalty might benefit from human medical insights would violate about 6 different protocols regarding interspecies medical practice and diplomatic propriety. "Dr. Veltaran," Queen Lireleth said with growing desperation, "what about the sensitivity treatments? Could heightened psychic awareness be causing overstimulation?" "Possible, Your Majesty, but infant psychic sensitivity typically doesn't manifest until several months of age. Testing would require procedures that..." He paused, clearly reluctant to subject a newborn to uncomfortable diagnostic processes. Marcus found himself stepping forward before conscious thought could override his medical instincts. "Your Majesty, may I offer an observation?" The entire diplomatic assembly turned to stare at him, a human sergeant presuming to address alien royalty about medical matters during sensitive peace negotiations. Ambassador Kane's expression suggested this breach of protocol was exactly the kind of incident he could use to further undermine Zephyrian credibility. "Sergeant Hayes," came the warning voice of Colonel Jennifer Park, his commanding officer, "please remember your position." "With respect, Colonel, my position is medical officer, and I'm observing symptoms that might have explanations the Zephyrian medical team hasn't considered." Queen Lireleth looked at him with the desperate hope of someone willing to consider any possibility that might help her child. "Sergeant Hayes, what observations?" "Your Majesty, the infant's crying patterns suggest sensory overload rather than illness. The rhythms, the intensity variations, the physical responses, I've seen similar symptoms in human children exposed to high-stress environments." Dr. Veltarun bristled with obvious offense at the suggestion that human medical knowledge could apply to royal Zephyrian physiology. "Sergeant, human and Zephyrian infant development follow completely different patterns. But stress responses might be similar across species," Marcus continued, addressing Queen Lireleth directly. "If the infant possesses heightened sensitivity, psychic or otherwise, the emotional chaos of failed negotiations, stressed adults, and general tension could be overwhelming her developing nervous system." "You're suggesting," Queen Lireleth said slowly, "that my daughter is crying because she's being psychically overwhelmed by everyone's stress and anger?" "I'm suggesting it's a possibility worth considering, Your Majesty." Ambassador Kane's laugh was coldly dismissive. "How convenient. The human soldier suggests that Zephyrian infant distress is actually the coalition's fault for maintaining appropriate diplomatic pressure." "I'm suggesting," Marcus replied with careful control, "that infant distress might be treatable through environmental management rather than medical intervention." As the royal infant's cries intensified, echoing through chambers where the fate of galactic peace hung in the balance, Marcus realized he was about to either help solve a crisis or destroy his military career by overstepping every boundary that separated human medical training from alien diplomatic protocol. But looking at Queen Lireleth's exhausted desperation and listening to an infant's distress that no one seemed able to address, Marcus found himself caring more about helping than about following rules that weren't designed for situations this unprecedented. By the 16th hour of continuous crying, the diplomatic crisis had escalated beyond inconvenience into potential treaty collapse. The infant's distress was affecting everyone on the station: sleep deprivation, stress-induced mistakes, and mounting irritability that made productive negotiation impossible. Marcus watched from his security post as Queen Lireleth swayed on her feet, held upright more by royal determination than physical strength. The constant crying had triggered a cascade of political complications that threatened to undo months of careful diplomacy. "Perhaps," suggested Ambassador Velthian of the neutral territories, "we should consider postponing negotiations until the royal household resolves its domestic challenges." "Absolutely not," Queen Lireleth replied with fierce pride despite her obvious exhaustion. "The Zephyrian Empire does not suspend vital galactic negotiations due to personal circumstances. Personal circumstances that are disrupting essential governmental functions," Ambassador Kane added with malicious satisfaction. "One begins to wonder about leadership capability when basic parental responsibilities prove overwhelming." Marcus had been observing the infant's behavior patterns through the nursery's transparent walls, and his medical assessment was becoming more certain with each passing hour. The baby wasn't ill, she was overwhelmed. Her crying intensified whenever arguments erupted in the nearby diplomatic chambers, settled slightly during calmer discussions, and became desperate whenever Queen Lireleth herself showed signs of stress. "Dr. Veltarun," he heard Queen Lireleth saying to her chief physician, "surely there must be something else we can try. Sedatives, containment fields, anything to provide relief." "Your Majesty, infant sedation carries significant risks, and containment fields might interfere with natural psychic development. Perhaps if we could relocate the child to quieter quarters." "I will not be separated from my daughter during her distress," Queen Lireleth said firmly. "There has to be another solution." Marcus made a decision that would either save the diplomatic crisis or end his military career. He approached Colonel Park with careful formality. Colonel, I request permission to offer medical consultation to the Zephyrian delegation. Sergeant Hayes, you're not qualified to treat alien physiology. But I am qualified to recognize stress-related disorders in infants, regardless of species. Colonel, with respect, that child isn't medically ill. She's psychically overwhelmed by the emotional chaos surrounding these negotiations. Colonel Park studied him with the expression of someone calculating political risks against potential solutions. Hayes, if you're wrong about this, you'll have created an interspecies diplomatic incident during peace negotiations. And if I'm right, we might save those negotiations by actually helping instead of just following protocol. After a long moment, Colonel Park nodded grimly. Approached the Zephyrian delegation. But Hayes, you're representing humanity here. Don't make us look incompetent. Marcus walked toward the royal chambers with every eye in the diplomatic complex following his progress. Queen Lireleth looked up as he approached, her expression mixing desperate hope with royal skepticism about human medical capabilities. Your Majesty, Marcus said with careful formality, I request permission to conduct a non-invasive assessment of the infant's behavioral patterns. Sergeant Hayes, Dr. Velteran interrupted, human medical training doesn't qualify you to evaluate Zephyrian royal physiology. Doctor, I'm not proposing to evaluate physiology. I'm proposing to evaluate environmental factors that might be causing behavioral distress. Queen Lyriletha's pointed ears perked with interest despite her exhaustion. Environmental factors. Your Majesty, if the infant possesses heightened sensitivity, psychic, emotional, or sensory, she might be reacting to stimuli that adults can filter out or ignore. The stress levels in this complex are extraordinary. Failed negotiations, political pressure, everyone's frustration and anger, if she's sensitive enough to perceive those emotions. She would be constantly overwhelmed by negative feelings she can't understand or escape, Queen Lireleth finished, understanding dawning in her violet eyes. Exactly. And the more distressed she becomes, the more stressed everyone else gets, creating a feedback loop that makes the situation worse for everyone. Dr. Velteran looked skeptical but intrigued. Sergeant, even if your assessment is correct, what treatment would you propose? We cannot simply eliminate diplomatic stress. We can manage it. Environmental controls, emotional regulation techniques, creating calm spaces that allow the infant's nervous system to settle. Marcus paused, knowing his next suggestion would be controversial. Your Majesty, in human medicine, we've found that stress-overwhelmed infants often respond best to caregivers who maintain calm emotional states regardless of external circumstances. You're suggesting that I'm too stressed to properly comfort my own child? Queen Lyriletha's voice carried dangerous undertones. I'm suggesting that you're under impossible pressure, and your daughter is sensitive enough to be affected by emotional states that would be invisible to most infants. Marcus chose his words carefully. Your Majesty, this isn't about parenting capability. It's about finding the right environmental conditions for a child with extraordinary sensitivities. Ambassador Kane stepped forward with predatory interest. How fascinating. The human suggests that Zephyrian royal parenting is inadequate compared to human techniques. I suggest, Marcus replied firmly, that infant care requires adaptation to individual needs rather than rigid adherence to cultural expectations. Queen Lireleth was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus with intensity that suggested she was evaluating not just his medical theories but his motivations and character. Sergeant Hayes, she said finally, if you're correct about environmental factors, what specific interventions would you recommend? Immediate stress reduction through isolation from diplomatic tensions, consistent caregiver with stable emotional state, and gradual reintroduction to normal environmental stimuli as the infant's nervous system adapts. And you believe this approach would succeed where traditional Zephyrian medicine has failed? Marcus met her gaze directly, understanding that his answer would determine not just the infant's welfare but the future of human Zephyrian diplomatic relations. Your Majesty, I believe that some problems require solutions that transcend cultural boundaries. Your daughter needs whatever works, not whatever tradition dictates. As the infant's cries reached a new pitch of desperation that made several diplomats wince with obvious discomfort, Queen Lireleth made the kind of decision that defined leadership under impossible circumstances. Dr. Veltarun, grant Sergeant Hayes permission to attempt his environmental intervention approach. We will evaluate results rather than debating theoretical frameworks. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of stares as he prepared to either validate human medical insights or demonstrate their complete inadequacy in the most public way possible. Either way, he was about to discover whether compassion could bridge the gaps that protocol and pride had failed to cross. The assessment Marcus conducted was unlike any medical examination he performed during his military career. Instead of focusing on physical symptoms, he studied the infant's behavioral responses to different environmental conditions, how her crying changed when diplomatic voices rose in anger, how she reacted to various people's proximity, how the intensity of her distress correlated with the emotional tension in nearby chambers. Fascinating, Dr. Veltarun observed, monitoring the infant's vital signs while Marcus documented behavioral patterns. Her stress responses do seem to correlate with external emotional stimuli rather than internal physiological distress. The sensitivity is remarkable, Marcus noted, watching how the baby's crying intensified whenever Ambassador Kane spoke with his characteristic diplomatic venom. She's responding to emotional states that most adults barely notice. Queen Lireleth watched the assessment with desperate hope mixed with royal skepticism. Sergeant Hayes, even if your diagnosis is correct, how do we provide the emotional calm you describe? I cannot simply abandon my diplomatic responsibilities to focus solely on child care. Your Majesty, the solution isn't about abandoning responsibilities, it's about managing environmental factors while maintaining necessary functions. Marcus paused, knowing his next suggestion would challenge both protocol and cultural expectations. The infant needs consistent exposure to emotional stability while her nervous system learns to process overwhelming stimuli. And you propose to provide this stability how? Marcus took a deep breath, understanding that his career was about to pivot in directions he'd never anticipated. Through direct caregiver intervention, Your Majesty. Someone trained in stress management who can maintain calm emotional states regardless of external circumstances. Ambassador Kane's laugh was sharp with malicious amusement. How convenient. The human soldier volunteers to serve as nursemaid to alien royalty. I volunteer, Marcus replied evenly, to provide medical intervention that addresses the root cause of the infant's distress rather than just managing symptoms. Sergeant, Dr. Veltarun said carefully, Royal Zephyrian infants have specific physiological needs that human caregivers cannot provide. Doctor, I'm not proposing to replace Zephyrian care. I'm proposing to supplement it with environmental management techniques that address the specific sensitivity issues we've identified. Queen Lireleth studied Marcus with intensity that made him feel as if she were evaluating his soul. Sergeant Hayes, you realize what you're suggesting? A human soldier serving as caregiver to the Zephyrian heir apparent during critical diplomatic negotiations? I'm suggesting whatever intervention gives your daughter the best chance of recovery, Your Majesty. The infant's cries reached a new level of desperation that made several diplomats cover their ears in obvious distress. Queen Lireleth swayed with exhaustion, Dr. Veltarun looked helpless despite his medical expertise, and the diplomatic negotiations ground to a complete halt as everyone waited for some kind of resolution. Your Majesty, Marcus said quietly, may I try? The question hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption about species boundaries, cultural propriety, and the nature of care itself. Queen Lireleth looked at her daughter's distress, then at Marcus's steady expression, then at the diplomatic crisis that her child's suffering was threatening to destroy. Dr. Veltarun, she said finally, monitor all vital signs. Ambassador Kane, document everything for your reports. Colonel Park, ensure your soldier understands the historical significance of this moment. Marcus approached the infant's bassinet with movements deliberately slow and calm, conscious that every gesture was being evaluated by representatives of multiple species. The baby girl was beautiful in the way that transcended species, delicate features, luminescent skin, pointed ears that marked her royal heritage, and eyes that seemed far too ancient for someone only 3 days old. "Hello, little one," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he'd learned to use with distressed children in war zones. "You've been having a really hard time, haven't you?" The infant's crying shifted slightly, not stopping, but changing pitch and intensity as if she were listening to something she'd never heard before. Marcus extended one finger toward her tiny hand, allowing her to grasp it with the instinctive grip that seemed universal among intelligent species. "It's been too loud and too scary, with too many people feeling too many strong emotions all around you." Her crying quieted further, violet eyes fixing on his face with focus that suggested recognition or at least curiosity about this new presence that felt different from the stressed adults who had been caring for her. "Everyone here loves you very much," Marcus continued, his voice maintaining the steady calm that was his natural demeanor rather than conscious technique. "But they've been so worried about you that their worry made everything feel even more overwhelming." The change was gradual but unmistakable. The infant's grip on his finger strengthened, her breathing became more regular, and her crying shifted from desperate wails to softer fussing that suggested discomfort rather than overwhelming distress. "That's better," Marcus said, carefully lifting the baby from her bassinet with movements that combined military precision with gentle care. "Sometimes what we need most is someone who isn't afraid, who isn't angry, who's just steady." The moment the infant settled against his chest, her crying stopped completely. The silence that followed was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the sudden release of tension that had been building for nearly 20 hours. Every person in the royal chamber stared in amazement as the Zephyrian heir apparent relaxed into peaceful contentment against a human soldier's uniform. "Impossible," Dr. Velteron whispered, monitoring readings that showed the infant's stress hormones dropping to normal levels for the first time since her birth. Queen Lyriletha's expression cycled through amazement, relief, and something that looked like gratitude mixed with wonder. "She's calm. Completely calm." "The emotional resonance is remarkable," Marcus observed, feeling the infant's tiny heart beating against his chest in steady rhythm rather than the rapid stress patterns he'd observed earlier. "She's responding to environmental stability rather than medical intervention." Ambassador Kane stared at the scene with obvious frustration at having his political ammunition diffused by successful problem-solving. "This is highly irregular. A human soldier caring for alien royalty." "This is effective," Queen Lyrilleth replied firmly, her own stress levels visibly dropping as her daughter's distress finally ended. "Results matter more than protocol when my child's welfare is at stake." As Marcus held the peacefully sleeping infant while diplomats from multiple species watched in amazement, he realized he had just crossed boundaries that would reshape both his career and the nature of interspecies cooperation in ways no one could have anticipated. The diplomatic transformation that followed the infant's peaceful sleep was as remarkable as the medical intervention itself. With the constant crying finally ended, Queen Lyrilleth could focus on negotiations rather than maternal crisis, while the other delegates found their stress levels dropping to manageable ranges for the first time in days. "The environmental management approach appears remarkably effective," Dr. Velteron observed, monitoring both the infant's vital signs and Marcus's stress response patterns. "The child's psychic sensitivity is responding positively to the caregiver's emotional stability." Marcus continued holding the sleeping infant, amazed by how natural the responsibility felt despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "She's incredibly sensitive to emotional input. In the right environment, that sensitivity could be a significant advantage rather than a vulnerability." Queen Lyrilleth approached slowly, her exhaustion giving way to wonder as she observed her daughter's peaceful contentment. "Sergeant Hayes, may I ask what experience prepared you for this type of intervention?" "Pediatric trauma care during human conflicts, Your Majesty. Children in war zones often develop similar stress responses to overwhelming environmental stimuli." Marcus adjusted his hold to allow Queen Lyrilleth better access to her daughter. "The principles of environmental management apply across species when dealing with sensory overload. And the infant responds to you specifically because my emotional baseline remains stable regardless of external circumstances. Military training, medical necessity, probably just personality factors that make me naturally calm under pressure." Ambassador Kane stepped forward with obvious reluctance to acknowledge what everyone could plainly observe. "This intervention has indeed resolved the immediate crisis." However, the long-term implications of human involvement in Zephyrian royal child care will be evaluated based on effectiveness rather than tradition. Queen Lireleth interrupted with authority that brooked no further argument. My daughter's welfare takes precedence over cultural expectations. Colonel Park approached with the careful expression of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about their subordinates' capabilities. Sergeant Hayes, it appears your medical intervention has succeeded where conventional approaches failed. Colonel, I think it's more accurate to say that identifying the right problem allowed us to apply the right solution. The infant was never medically ill, she was environmentally overwhelmed. And now? Marcus looked down at the peacefully sleeping baby in his arms, marveling at how someone so small could have caused such large-scale diplomatic crisis. Now she needs consistent environmental management until her nervous system learns to filter overwhelming stimuli. That's probably a long-term process rather than a one-time intervention. Queen Lireleth's expression grew thoughtful as she processed the implications. Sergeant Hayes, would you be willing to serve as medical liaison between our species? Your insights into stress-related disorders could benefit both human and Zephyrian populations. Your Majesty, I'm honored by the offer, but I should point out that I'm a military medic, not a diplomatic specialist. You're someone who solved a problem that defeated our most experienced physicians through compassion and practical application of cross-species medical knowledge. Queen Lireleth's smile was radiant with relief and gratitude. That combination of skills is exactly what interspecies cooperation requires. Ambassador Kane made one final attempt to complicate the situation. This arrangement would create unprecedented protocols for human involvement in alien governmental functions. This arrangement, Queen Lireleth said firmly, demonstrates that effective solutions transcend species boundaries when approached with genuine desire to help rather than political calculation. The negotiations that resumed over the following days proceeded with remarkable efficiency now that all parties could focus on diplomacy rather than managing infant-related crisis. Marcus found himself serving as unofficial advisor on stress management techniques, his success with the royal infant having established credibility that extended far beyond pediatric care. The peace accords are proceeding ahead of schedule, Colonel Park observed as they reviewed the day's diplomatic progress. Amazing what people can accomplish when they're not sleep-deprived and stress-overwhelmed. Amazing what can be accomplished when everyone focuses on solving problems rather than protecting pride, Marcus replied, watching through the nursery window as Queen Lireleth successfully fed her daughter for the first time since birth. Hayes, you realize your career has taken a rather unexpected turn. Medical liaison to alien royalty wasn't exactly in your original job description. Marcus smiled, feeling the infant's tiny hand grip his finger with the strength that suggested she was thriving under the environmental management approach. Colonel, I've learned that the most important jobs are often the ones nobody planned for. 6 months later, the Hayes Lireleth Pediatric Research Center had become the leading facility for interspecies stress-related disorders, with Marcus serving as chief medical advisor and Queen Lireleth as diplomatic sponsor. Their collaboration had revolutionized understanding of how emotional sensitivity could be managed as strength rather than vulnerability across multiple alien species. Any regrets about becoming the galaxy's first interspecies child care specialist? Queen Lireleth asked as they reviewed applications from families seeking help with stress-sensitive children. Only that it took a diplomatic crisis to discover that helping children transcends every boundary we think divides us, Marcus replied, watching through the research center's windows as human and alien children played together under the care of specialists who understood that sensitivity could be cultivated rather than suppressed. Princess Lyra seems to be developing remarkable abilities, Queen Lireleth observed, noting how her now 6-month-old daughter was demonstrating psychic capabilities that exceeded normal Zephyrian development timelines. She had the advantage of learning emotional regulation from birth rather than having to overcome early trauma, Marcus explained. Environmental management from infancy allows natural abilities to develop without the defensive barriers that typically limit psychic potential. Their research center had become a model for interspecies cooperation, proving that the most profound solutions often came from individuals willing to cross boundaries that others considered absolute. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that caring for children, regardless of species, required the same fundamental qualities: patience, consistency, and the courage to prioritize need over convention. Ready for today's intake evaluations? Marcus asked, checking his schedule of families from 7 different species seeking help with stress-sensitive children. With you as co-director. I'm ready for whatever challenges the galaxy wants to present, Queen Lireleth replied, their professional partnership having evolved into friendship built on shared commitment to helping children thrive rather than merely survive.
As they walked toward the evaluation rooms where parents from across the galaxy brought children who needed the kind of understanding that transcended species boundaries, Marcus reflected on how holding one crying infant had led to a career dedicated to proving that compassion was the most universal language in the universe. The alien queen's baby had indeed stopped crying, but more importantly, her peaceful sleep had become the foundation for cooperation that helped children across multiple worlds find the calm they needed to develop their extraordinary potential.